Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to start by welcoming the decisive action announced by our new Prime Minister to halt rising energy bills. This vital support will save families £1,000 on their bills, on top of the £37 billion of help that's already been announced. And I'm sure the whole Chamber will welcome the measures from the UK Government to support people and businesses across the country right now. First Minister, yesterday your government announced £560 million of cuts. The cost of living crisis means difficult decisions for governments all over the country. But do you now regret that so much money was wasted on ferries that haven't been built? A scandal that so far cost taxpayers £250 million when that money could have been used to address the cost of living crisis.
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, can I also take the opportunity to welcome the very belated action on energy bills that the new Prime Minister has just announced in the House of Commons. I've not yet seen all of the detail, but I am aware of the headline. But while I welcome it, can we also be very clear, Presiding Officer, it does not represent a halt to the rise in energy bills. Average energy bills right now are just under £2,000. A cap of £2,500 will still see people pay more for their energy. And of course, if we go back to the spring of this year, average energy bills were around £1,200. So people are seeing soaring energy costs because of a broken energy market and the utter incompetence of this UK government. So, and lastly on that issue, as things stand, all of the costs of what has been announced today are going to fall on consumers and taxpayers, when oil and gas companies making windfall profits should be making a contribution. So I think we can see whose side the UK government is on today. Secondly, Presiding Officer, yes, the Deputy First Minister outlined savings that are having to be made in the Scottish Government's budget this year. Let me remind the purpose of those savings. Firstly, so that we can ensure that public sector workers get the fairest possible pay rises. And secondly, that we continue to target resources to those who need them most in this cost of living crisis. So that is the backdrop, a budget this year that, because of inflation, is worth £1.7 billion less than it was when we published it. So the other thing we need to see the new Prime Minister do is increase funding for devolved administration so we can support public services and public sector workers. And lastly, Presiding Officer, no, I don't regret the actions this government took to save Ferguson's shipyard and to ensure that those working there still have a job. That is important. And of course, we will continue to take action to ensure that the two ferries are completed and that work continues.
Dr. Shaw.
Well, there we have it. It's official. Nicola Sturgeon doesn't regret wasting £250 million of taxpayers' money when that money is needed right now to help our services. Because if her government hadn't wasted £250 million trying and failing to build ferries, that money could have been used elsewhere in the SNP's budget. These failures leave islanders without lifeline services, and they take money away from the frontline spending we need here in Scotland. We know that nearly £50 million of emergency COVID support went to fix these ferries instead of going to the businesses who needed it. An internal analysis by the ferry operator CMAL has indicated that the number and the severity of the issues and faults with these ships means that it will be, to quote them, difficult for the vessels to achieve acceptance by CMAL and enter into service. So what plans does the First Minister have in place if, as the experts fear may be the case, these vessels never become fit to sail and more money needs to be diverted away from the cost of living crisis to make up for these failures?
First Minister.
Firstly, Presiding Officer, what Douglas Ross has just said about COVID money being directed to Ferguson's is simply not true, and he should, I think, take the opportunity to reflect on that and withdraw that. That misunderstanding came from the name of a particular budget line. It did not reflect how money had been allocated, and I believe Although if I'm wrong on this, media sources have already corrected that, so perhaps Douglas Ross wants to reflect further on that. Secondly, on the issues around ferries, I have made clear on many occasions my regret at the cost overrun of that. That is why it is so important we continue to focus on completing the ferries. But even if we took Douglas Ross at his word about £250 million, which of course wouldn't be in 1 year, that would still leave the rest of the £1.7 billion that her budget has been eroded by because of inflation soaring out of control under this UK government. It would still leave us with the £700 million that we have had to allocate unbudgeted for higher pay deals because of the soaring inflation being presided over by this UK government. So we'll continue to take the hard decisions to get support to where it is needed most. Of course, one of the pressures on all construction projects right now is inflation, which this UK government is failing to get under control. But we will continue to focus on making sure the ferries now are completed on the revised budget and on the revised timeline.
Douglas Ross.
Oh yes. Well done. Well done. Muted applause there because, of course, the First Minister did her usual thing to blame Westminster for everything, but not actually address the question that I put.
Mr. Ross, I will not have members shouting at one another from a sedentary position. Please just resist the temptation. Mr. Ross.
Well, I hope the Deputy First Minister does resist that temptation, although he seems to do it quite a lot, because he doesn't want to hear what members are saying. The First Minister's answer was all about what the UK government have done wrong. Nothing about what CMAL are saying about these ships may never enter service. All that money, hundreds of millions of pounds that could be wasted. And today, the First Minister's former right-hand man, the disgraced Derek Mackay, appeared before a Scottish Parliament committee to discuss the ferry scandal. A scandal that has hit Scottish public finances and where we still don't know why the government made the disastrous call they did. At the Public Audit Committee today, the ex-Finance Minister outlined what he believes went wrong with these contracts before we understand he was smuggled out of this building by Parliament officials. So does the First Minister agree with all of the evidence that Derek Mackay gave today?
First Minister.
I have not had the opportunity to look at all of the evidence that Derek Mackay gave to the committee. I'm sure I will take the opportunity to do that as soon as I'm able to, and then Douglas Ross, I'm sure, will come back and ask me more about this. But Douglas Ross keeps quoting CMAL and saying that CMAL's view is that the ferries will never be in service. So let me quote the Chief Executive of CMAL, Kevin Hobbs, just in June, and I'm quoting directly here. There is not much now which is standing in the way of both of them being delivered. There are a lot of detractors out there saying rather spurious things about them, but we've always had a view that both would be finished. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the detractors out there saying rather spurious things was a reference to Douglas Ross. Others, of course, may reach that conclusion.
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Like it, but CMAL have said that the number and the severity of faults may lead to the fact that these ships never sail. So if the First Minister doesn't want to hear it, that's fine, but that's coming from CMAL. But it seems she doesn't like to hear a lot of things. It's amazing, just amazing, how often Nicola Sturgeon has never seen or never heard anything that is potentially a difficult question. But we know there was significant evidence given by Derek Mackay today. But during the First Minister's recent run at the Edinburgh Fringe, she said the disastrous ferry contracts weren't a scandal. Well, this is where we saw the First Minister during the summer, and she said the ferry contracts weren't a scandal. Her words at the Edinburgh Fringe were, well, I'll wait for the SNP to be quiet, because I think it's important everyone hears this. The First Minister's words were, this has not been a scandal with the ferries. It's a situation. A situation. £250 million up in smoke, nothing to show for it. If that's not a scandal, I don't know what is. But today, even disgraced Derek Mackay accepted that the purchase of these ferries was catastrophic That's the bit maybe Nicola Sturgeon didn't see today. Her former loyal lieutenant admitting how awful this mistake was, even though it further ruins his already trashed reputation. So why can't Nicola Sturgeon admit that this is a downright scandal that is taking hundreds of millions of pounds away from tackling the cost of living crisis that we are facing here in Scotland right now?
First Minister.
Firstly, I'm happy to answer any questions on this. I've answered many questions on this and I've made my views very clear on this. But Douglas Ross doesn't like it when he quotes CMAL, and I quote the Chief Executive saying the exact opposite. So perhaps he should be less selective in that. But on the wider issues, Douglas Ross has stood up here, and I think it is quite staggering, and says there's nothing to show for the investment in Ferguson's shipyard. I don't know about a Conservative, but I think almost 400 jobs does not equate to nothing to show. We value people's jobs, and we take action wherever we can to protect people's jobs, and that is perhaps the difference between this government and the Conservatives. We'll continue to focus on the job at hand. That is what people expect of us, and I will happily answer any questions for as long as Douglas Ross wants to ask questions on this issue. But I suspect Douglas Ross's choice of topic today is more a reflection on his own difficulties than anything else. After all, it's not me that started this new parliamentary term with one MSP standing down from his front bench and another MSP quitting Parliament altogether. So perhaps he's not got his own troubles to seek.
Now we move to question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Presiding Officer, the cost of living crisis is a national emergency. Therefore, I welcome that we have finally seen action from the UK Government, but I do not believe it goes far enough. Let's be clear, this is not a freeze. Energy prices will still be going up for households across the country. And there is not enough support for businesses and charities, and there is no meaningful windfall tax, meaning households and businesses will pay in the long term, not companies who are making record profits. Moving to the action that the Scottish Government can take, I welcome the commitment to a rent freeze and a winter eviction ban. This is long overdue, but I think it needs to go further. So can I ask the First Minister, when will the legislation be brought to Parliament? Given the majority of social rents will rise on April 1st, will she extend the freeze to cover this period? Will she commit to a review towards the end of the freeze with an option to extend if necessary? And to avoid a sharp hike when the freeze is lifted, will she commit that a rent regulator will be in place in order to cap any future rises?
First Minister.
So firstly, the emergency legislation will be introduced very soon. We haven't yet determined the date for that, but we need to introduce it soon because Parliament needs to act at pace to pass that. We want that legislation to be passed within 3 months so that the freeze I announced was effective from that date. So that will happen at pace, and I would encourage all members to engage very constructively with the detail of that. As all members will be aware, it's important that we get legislation right to ensure that if there are any legal challenges to it, it has the best possible chance of withstanding those. Secondly, yes, I will commit to an ongoing review of the emergency legislation. We have said very clearly that we intend the 2 proposals that I announced on Tuesday, the rent freeze and the moratorium on evictions, to be in place until at least the end of March, and we will review that regularly, and of course we will keep open the option of extending that further depending on the wider situation. And lastly, I also said this on Tuesday, these are by definition, because they are emergency measures, temporary. How temporary they prove to be will depend on the reviews that I have just spoken about, but they are intended to pave the way for longer term reforms, to bring greater affordability to the rented sector, particularly to the private rented sector, and to give greater protections to tenants. So the wider issues that Anna Sarwar has raised today will fully be taken into account in that longer term work.
Anna Sarwar.
I welcome that response from the First Minister. We will engage proactively with the legislation, and the sooner we can do that, taking into account the legal complexities, the better. We will continue to push for the freeze to cover the 1st of April because that will give people certainty. We welcome the agreement to review with a view to extending as an option. And I would again push the First Minister on implementing a rent regulator so we can make sure there is not excessive increases when the freeze is finally lifted. But rents are not the only costs that are rising. We have been calling for a rent freeze since June, but we've also been calling for a reduction in rail fares since April. In the summer, the SNP published a document outlining what actions European countries were taking in the face of the cost of living crisis. In that document, they included examples from Germany, Spain and Ireland, who have all cut rail fares. ScotRail is now in public ownership. The decision on rail fares is for this government. So will the First Minister commit to Labour's plan for having rail fares, which could save commuters up to £130 a month?
First Minister.
Well, again, let me take two aspects of that issue, and what I'm about to say, I intend to be constructive, and I would invite Labour to engage constructively on both of these points. We have confirmed, as I did on Tuesday, a freeze in ScotRail fares until the end of March. The Deputy First Minister said yesterday that we will be considering, in the context of our emergency budget review, extending that further. And we will also consider, in the context of that emergency budget review, not just on rail fares, but on a whole range of other areas where we can go further to help people with the cost of living crisis. But it is important, not just important, it is inevitable and essential that it is done in the context of that budget review. I set out very starkly, as did the Deputy First Minister yesterday, the realities of our budget position. £1.7 billion less, so it is worth, than when we published it. Increasing pressures from public sector pay, from the cost of housing Ukrainians, for example, which none of us grudge at all. We can't raise taxes within a financial year. We can't borrow for day-to-day spending, and all of our reserves are already allocated. So if we want to spend more on anything, we have to find other places in our budget to take that from. That process started yesterday. So I say in all sincerity to Anna Sarwar, we will consider in good faith any suggestion that is made, but any suggestion that involves more spending in this financial year has to come with a saving from elsewhere. So I would encourage Anna Sarwar to engage on that part as well.
Anna Sarwar.
Again, thank the First Minister for that answer. I think we need to go further than a freeze. To be clear, getting more passengers on our railways actually potentially makes money for our railways. Also, it helps us confront not just the cost of living crisis, but also the climate crisis, if we can change that pattern of behaviour, get people out of vehicles and into our railways. So I would push the First Minister to be bolder and more ambitious, because this is not a time for timidity or for delay. Our Emergency Cost of Living Act included a rent freeze and a winter eviction ban, which we welcome, but it also included having rail fares, capping bus fares, a £100 water bill rebate, writing off school meal debts, topping up the Scottish Welfare Fund and establishing a business hardship fund to help keep small businesses going. Now, I know the First Minister will say that the Scottish Government has to find the money. That is why I welcome an emergency budget review, but it has to be an open, genuine and transparent one. So in recognising the national emergency, open up the books to all parties, and let's have a Team Scotland approach to actually using the powers of this Parliament to confront the cost of living crisis and help people here in Scotland.
First Minister.
We'll engage on that basis, and I'm sure the Deputy First Minister will be happy to have open discussions with any party about how we meet this challenge, as long as the starting point for that discussion is accepting the reality. If we want to spend more on anything this year, as all of us I think do, that money has to be found elsewhere in our budget. On some of the things Anna Sarwar has suggested, we will consider everything in good faith, but take bus fares for example. Around half of the Scottish population don't pay for bus travel already. Nobody under 22, nobody over 60. So that is a sign of how we're using the powers of this Parliament. In terms of increasing money, I know Labour called for that to be in the tenant hardship fund, but we've doubled the fuel insecurity fund. We have committed to increasing the budget for discretionary housing payments. Of course, we are extending free school meals beyond any other government in the UK, and the Scottish child payment, once the extensions announced earlier this week take effect, that will deliver £1,300 in support for every eligible child under the age of 16. Again, that doesn't exist anywhere else in the UK. We are using our powers and we will continue to do them. And let me just share some reflections from somebody else well known to Anna Sarwar this week. This week's programme for government, announced by the First Minister, was a creative and coherent response to the poverty pandemic we are all facing. And credit where it's due, the SNP are being upfront and on the front foot in explaining what is happening to the public finances. These are comments from Kezia Dugdale, one of Anna Sarwar's predecessors as Scottish Labour leader.
We now move to constituency and general supplementaries, and I